As a review, this is what I call the CSS box model. Other people call it that too. So the CSS box model is the relationship of three areas around content. These are the three areas. So this word hello is the content. That word hello could be an image or some other box of content. Any of these elements can have a border, and that border will go around the box. Outside of the border is some space called margin. So if you set margin, that extra space will be applied outside of the border, like that green color shows. If you set padding, padding is space inside the border. Now, if you don't have a border, then it might be the case that you could achieve the same effect with either padding or margin, because they're both like invisible-ish space. If you give an item a background color, it will fill in the space inside the border where the padding is. So that is a difference between margin and padding. The margin is always like invisible. Okay, but padding would be really the size of the element when it has background color. Notice that the margin is outside of the border and the padding is inside of the border. You feeling that? So that's, to me, one of the things that you just got to memorize, internalize when you're working with CSS, that's where margin and padding are in relation to each other and to the border. As we saw in that video, some types of elements, like inline elements, which would be images by default, can't have margin. And that's why I had to change the image to be inline block. So inline block is this kind of hybrid where it's still inline-ish, but it has a few abilities of a block element, one of which is the ability to have margin. So this is the CSS box model. We did this before, so I'm going to skip it after it does its animations. I think we talked about border. We talked about with border, we can specify border width, border style, and border color. But most commonly, in my experience, I use the border shorthand to specify all three with one line of code. That is the size of the border, the style of the border, and the color of the border. And typically, I would never use dotted. I would almost always use solid. So I remember the word solid. We solid on that? Okay, good. So those are the three parts of border. We went through before and talked about padding and how with padding, border, and margin, you can specify one number here, this 10 pixels, and that means it'll be 10 pixels on all four sides, or you can specify all four sides individually, or you can specify 2, and it'll be left and right and top and bottom. So we covered this before, same for margin. So I'm going to skip through here and get to the one new thing. Okay, this is important as well. And I would say this is another one of those things that you ought to just memorize for how much it comes up. And we will learn some new tricks as well. But let me teach you these old tricks because they always work. If you want to center inline content, inline, that's like text. To center inline content, use text-align center on its parent. So this would cause all the text in the body to be centered. All the inline things, which are mostly text, but it would also be images. So to center inline things, then use text align center. Okay? Problem is, text align center will not center a box inside its parent. That is, it won't center block elements. It'll only center the text that's in the block element, not the whole block element. So if you had your whole page, imagine this is your page. And you had this box here that's a div. Say this is a div. And you'd like it to be centered horizontally. Text align won't do anything to that because text align only works for inline elements. You with me so far? Right. The only way this is going to work as well, let me note, this width, let's say it's 200 pixels, that has to be narrower than the width of the page. That kind of makes sense just logically, that there's no way to center something if it's the same size as the thing that it's in, because there's no extra space to center within. So the, let me go through the thing. So that's inline is text align center. If you have a block element, the magic is make its left and right margin be auto. Left and right margin. They've listed this out with all four. So this would be 10 pixels top, auto right, 10 pixels bottom, auto left. So if you have a block element that you want to center, then you want to say that the margin will you let me do this with one keyword? Thank you. Like Kevin Powell likes to do. The margin inline means left and right, is auto. I know that's a little bit confusing. If you'd rather, you could say margin 0 auto. And this is the top bottom. That's the left. So in some way, set the left and right margin to be auto. And the element has to have a width that's less than the full width. What you see in this case, they set the width of the paragraph to be 300 pixels. By default, how wide is a block element if you don't say anything? You remember this? It's always 100% of its parent. So by default, you can try to center it, but there won't be any space to center it, so it won't look like it's centered. So you've got to make it in some way a width that's 50%, which would mean 50% of its parent, or some number of pixels or something, if you want to center the whole box. So these two tricks come up a lot where you want to horizontally center content. If it's text content, we use text align center. If it's block content, then we need to set the left and right margin to auto in one of those two ways. Either of those two ways would work. That second one, you would then also be specifying that the top and bottom margin are 0. If that's not what you want, then make the top and bottom what you want. Notice too, you don't have to have units if it's 0, because 0 of anything is 0. Okay, so that's how we horizontally center content. You feeling good on that? Questions? Here's their picture of this, which I could just bring up. But you notice in the first paragraph, the text is center aligned, but the whole box is left aligned. Down here, the content is actually left aligned. The text is left aligned, but the whole box is centered because it has that margin of 0, that margin of auto. We're going to ignore that. This is pretty important as well. And now you've already seen it in that video. You can change the display mode of any element. If something is inline by default and you want it to be block, then just say display block. If you say display block, then you can make an image a block element by changing its nature. And likewise, if you wanted list items to be kind of like text align, I think we did this in example 2 in a nav, you could set them to be inline. Now, this is one way of doing that. Perhaps more significantly, you can set display to be none. And if you set display none, then that element will just go away as if it weren't in the HTML. Sometimes that's useful. It's actually probably the way that, if you ever seen a drop-down menu, you know those drop-down menus where you like hover over a menu and then another menu pops up. What's really going on there is that other menu was always there. It was just hidden in the CSS. And when you hover over the parent menu, it changes display none to display block. And then it'll appear when it was gone. So display none is actually pretty useful as a way to allow interactivity. And there are probably some other uses as well. So you can't tell, but there's an element in this menu that's not there anymore. There is another CSS property called visibility, and visibility has this value hidden, and you can set visibility to be hidden, and it'll also hide an element, but the space will still be reserved for it. So honestly, I don't find myself using that very much, but I'm sure there are use cases for it. So in this case, there is a list item that's right here in that space. When we say display none, it's like disappeared entirely from the logical document. It's in the source code, but we've hidden it with CSS. When you say visibility hidden, it still takes up space. It's just not visible. So you can do it either way, depending on what your use case is. Okay. Just like 1 or 2 more things, I promise. Thanks for hanging with me. We can put a shadow behind boxes. Ooh. And these are the apparently 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 different properties, which is a lot. So hang with me here, and then I'll show you an easier way of dealing with this. Notice these things that are in square brackets mean that they're optional. And they have some default value if you don't set them. Generally, I see we're going to put the 5. You usually wouldn't put inset because usually your shadows aren't inside the thing, they're outside. Outside is by default. This is like we talked about with the text shadows. With shadows, the 2 things that we have to set are how far in the X direction horizontally is the shadow offset. So you've got your actual element, your box, and then you've got your shadow. So how far X do we want to go? Positive would be to the right, negative would be to the left. The second one is vertical, so that's how far down. Positive is down and negative is up. How far do we want the shadow from offset vertically? Blur is how blurry it is, and the spread is how kind of wide it goes out. And then you can also specify color. And here's some examples. I don't know if really these should be live examples, but notice this, -5, -5. So you see the shadow is moved to the left 5 and up 5, and then it's this 777 gray color. It has no blur or spread, so it's a crisp shadow. It's exactly, there's no blurriness to it. On this one, they added I mean, it's in the positive direction. So it's, you see 5 to the right, 5 down, and it has 5 pixels of blur. So there's 5 more pixels that makes it blurry. In this case, you see I've added another 5 pixels of spread in addition to the blur. So it's even more shadowed, which I feel like then gives you the impression that it's further from the page. I think, isn't that that would make sense, yeah. In this case, I kind of, sometimes this is a nice shadow. So it's 0, 0, so it's exactly behind it. If you didn't have a blur or a spread, you wouldn't be able to see it, but you do. So you see here, there's, yeah, it's overlapping in those 10 pixels. And then lastly, if you set inset, you just set the inset keyword, then it makes the shadow go on the inside of the thing, which in this case, to me, it doesn't really look like a shadow anymore. To me, it makes it look like the button is curvy. Do you feel that? So there's a lot of interesting effects that you can achieve with these.
To me, it looks like it's inset into the background.
Okay, yeah, it does that too. Yeah, I see that. But I think what it means is that the shadow is inset into the element. There's all the ones we just saw. If I were going to do shadows though too, I might open up a browser and say CSS box shadow generator. And there's all these sites that make it really easy to that's funny. You see it still doing it. This is the yellow box with this black background. And you see here, you can just change these. You see it? And it shows you in real time what it would look like. I can change the shadow color. Let me click on this. Yeah, so you can make some nice glow stuff here. So notice, these are really just the things I just taught you. The horizontal offset, you see that? How much left, right? The vertical offset. The blur. And the spread. Does that make sense? I think you can't blur more than the spread, I bet. And I find opacity is often useful as well. If you, can I change this background color? Yes. Oh, that's really gross. If your opacity is less, this is the opacity of the shadow color, then the shadow itself will be a little see-through. And to me, that sort of makes sense. This looks a little gross, but it'll make the shadow less harsh, I think, because it'll end up blending in with the background. But the cool thing here is, if you like to just move this around until you get the look that you're looking for, they give you how to do this in all the old browsers. But honestly, this last line that says box shadow, can you see that? It has all the numbers, and you didn't have to type them. And I would just copy paste this into your CSS. You see what I mean? You can kind of extract it. I mean, there's a number of pixels. So this is, right, this is horizontal, vertical, blur, spread, and then a color. They're going to specify the color in RGBA, though, so that the color of the shadow is has an alpha. I wonder if you take the opacity to 0. Nope, it always does that. Okay. And there's lots of sites like this on lots of things, like even, well, the one we were just on, wrong way. Looks like, it'll create a gradient for you. It'll create a border radius. It'll create noise. I don't know, can you see the noise? Can you see it now? We haven't talked about background images yet, but we will. But there's some cool stuff that you can do here without having to write it all yourself. which I'm for using the tools to make our life easier. Yeah, likewise, we'll come back to this, but this isn't that hard to understand. We should talk about this. Let's find a good gradient. I'm a big fan of gradients. You probably can't tell that's a gradient, can you? Let's see. Can you see the difference now? Yeah. So this feels like sometimes a subtle gradient is really nice. I mean, if you make it look like a sunset, that can be kind of cool too. To me, that doesn't look good. I don't like that. They call the different colors in a gradient a stop. So this lets you put in more than one stop. Let me do this. You can make the whole thing different levels of opaqueness. So you can go from one color to another color, and let me just do it here. This is the syntax that I would consider. It's a little bit cumbersome as well. You have to have the word linear gradient, and then you have to say to right, to left, to bottom. You with me? Like you could change the direction of the gradient, and then you've got to have your first color, your first stop, and what percentage the stop is. So it's at 0%. And then there's another color here that's at 100%. And you can put in more than one stop. That syntax, though, to me is kind of cumbersome. You with me? We could change what direction it is. And so often to me, using one of these generators or finding a gradient that I like and then changing it is easier. You could copy paste all this to get maximum usability. I would be inclined to just get this guy. Basically, this is for old Microsoft browsers. This is for old Opera browsers. This is for old Safari and Chrome. This is also for old Safari and Chrome. This is for Mozilla. Do you see this little dash Moz, dash WebKit? When they release a new feature, browsers will support it in a browser-specific way, even before it's been standardized. And that's what those little prefixes mean. Okay, that's more than you wanted to know. And there's nothing magic about this site either. There's lots of gradient generators. I've seen some that were better than this. But notice, so the linear gradient, I think you could also have a radial gradient as well. Where's that? This guy. So if you want it to be more like a circle, you see how you can do that, and then it just makes it a radial gradient. You can just set this as the value of the background property. If you do this, the smart thing to do is to also set the background color first to just be a flat color, and then afterwards set it to have your gradient. And that way, if you happen to be on an old browser that doesn't know gradients, it'll fall back to the right color. Okay. Okay, all right. We already did this as well, but take this one in. We often want to have rounded corners, and this is the way to do it, border radius. It's as if you're drawing a little circle on the corner. So you got this straight square, and if I drew like a really big circle there, so I would need it to be completely contained in the thing. And then if I cut that off, you with me? This radius, that radius right there, that's what you're specifying. So if it's a big number, it's a big circle. If it's a small number, it's a small circle. In which case you'd have a much smaller corner. Does that make sense? So, boom. Rounded corners. Amazing. If you make the border radius half the height, then it'll become a full circle. If you make something a square, so that it has the same width and height, and then set its border radius as half of its height, which is half of its width, then you'll get a full circle. I'll show you that in the max one. You can do some crazy stuff and actually put different border radii on different corners. And here's some wild examples here of kind of elliptical border radii. You see here, in this case, you're giving different radius values to the top, to the four corners. So you can actually get weird stuff like this where there's an elliptical curve, not a circle, but an ellipse on just one corner. Or in this case, you see they put it different values. There might be a value for this. I mean, to me, this almost looks like a Post-it note. So there's some cool stuff you can do with that. And likewise, the circle is really commonly used. If you want to make a circle, you don't need an image. You can do it with CSS. Just make sure you've got a square and the same big border radius. Okay, summing this up, CSS treats each element as if it's in its own box. Boxes have dimensions like height and width. We can specify a min height, a max height, a min width, a max width. We have our content, padding around the content, border around the padding, and margin around the border. And that's going to help us lay out things and add enough spacing around those things. We can hide and show values. If we hide with display none, it goes away completely, like it's not there at all. If we change visibility to hidden, then the browser will reserve space for the thing, but it won't show the thing. There'll be a space in there. We can change block level things to inline things and inline to block, and we can even be in the middle and have inline dash block and make something that's kind of a little bit both. CSS lets us do cool things like rounded borders, and we can even do image borders, but that doesn't seem that useful to me. Oh, perhaps most importantly, we learned how to center things horizontally. If it's an inline element, we use text align center, and if it's a block element, we set the left and right margins to auto. Okay, we're going to pause here, and I'm going to invite you to close your computers.